Greetings fellow painters, Trehane here. Today we paint up Hastur for your Cthulhu Death May Die board game. I'm starting with a white rattle can primed miniature this time around, and then I'm taking some muted violet ink by Liquitex and just airbrushing it all over the miniature. I actually would not do this. I would not recommend this. It is far too translucent, resulting in too bright of a finish, and so I quickly abandon the airbrush and move on to just applying the same ink, muted violet, with an oversized brush. And speaking of things that I wouldn't do, I actually commit a pretty grievous error near the end of this paint job, and I am also going to include a little outtake at the end of this video to show you exactly what happened. It's pretty disappointing, but you'll see. Anyway, I am really slathering on the muted purple. The idea behind this base coat is that when I apply the translucent yellow ink on top of this, being that it's a complementary color to the purple, it should give me sort of a sickly brown color anywhere where the yellow is over the purple. So I'm going to leave this purple in the recesses and move on to dry brushing some highlights on this model. So the yellow on the highlights will show very yellow, and anywhere in the deep folds of the cloak where I leave the dark purple, I want it to appear as sort of a sickly brown color. I'm going to paint this model so that the right side of the model is deep in shadow and the left side of the model is receiving direct light. Therefore, when dry brushing, I'm going to focus heavily on the left side of the model and leave the right side of the model fairly untouched. As I'm doing this dry brushing process, you can really see the difference in light between the right and left side of the model, almost to where it looks like different stages in the process, but I can assure you that this is all the same stage in the process, even though it looks like two separate models. And now we're going to move on to some intentional and very focused highlights using titanium white ink. We're going to focus these highlights on the areas that would catch the most light, such as any edges on the cloak, as well as any upward facing areas. And I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, hey, this is just Slapchop with a purple base coat. And to that I say, maybe. And we are also going to add these highlights only to the forward facing edges on the dark side of the mini, as well as applying it to some of the tentacles on the base. Once the highlights are looking good, we're going to move on to adding yellow to the miniature with some standard yellow ink, darkened just a little bit with muted gray ink by Liquitex. When applying the inks with the brush, you want to work fast, but you also want to make sure that the yellow ink doesn't pool in any of the recesses where you worked so hard to create those shadows. You do want to paint one thin layer in the recesses just so you get that transition to brown. However, I soon tire of this and switch to the airbrush for a smooth, even coat. This will result in more work later as I have to cover up the yellow that I oversprayed onto the base. Once the yellow is fully base coated, I move on to adding some titanium white ink to the yellow ink and muted gray ink mix. This mix will be used to further build up the midtones and also lay in the groundwork for our highlighted areas. I'm keeping muted gray in the mix as I want to keep the yellow somewhat desaturated since this is kind of a grimy creature. I will build up the highlights just by adding more and more titanium white to the mix. I'm also noticing at this point that the mix of the yellow over the muted gray ink is reading more of a green color rather than the sickly brown that I had envisioned, but I am going to go back and address this later in the painting process. This probably means that the muted violet that I was using has a little too much blue in it to achieve the results that I was looking for. We continue to add titanium white to our mix of yellow and muted gray to continue the highlighting process. Each time we add more titanium white to the yellow mix, we build the highlights by applying the paint to smaller and smaller areas of each highlighted feature of the mini. We will finish the highlighting process by dotting in some nearly pure titanium white to some of the most dramatically highlighted areas. The model's starting to look a little bit washed out right now with all those highlights, so I'm going to go back with just some pure yellow ink, diluted just a little bit with water, and I'm going to start glazing in the yellow over some of those highlights to bring up the saturation of the yellow color. Using a diluted ink will allow me to achieve this in several passes so that I do not knock down the brightness too much in some of the areas that I want to remain very bright. Now that the yellow cloak has its color back, we're going to use some red wash by Vallejo and start glazing in some character to this model. The red wash will be glazed heavily along the bottom fringe of Hastur's robe, as well as some of the creases and folds around his head and anywhere that the flesh-like tentacles are protruding from his clothing. And unlike the yellow highlights, this color should be added to the dark side of the mini as well. As is usual with this style of painting, we're going to apply the red glaze in several coats, building up to some very strong color in selected areas, but it will be a smooth radiation in color from the lightest to darkest red. Next, we will take some acrylic medium and mix it in with our muted purple and get to work on the shadows. Any acrylic medium or glaze medium will work. You can use Lamian medium by Citadel, Noosh by Monument, or even this more traditional glaze medium by Winsor & Newton. We're going to work this purple glaze into all the shadow areas, which will predominantly be in the folds and creases of Hastur's robe. This purple glaze will neutralize some of that green tint that was prevalent after we applied our first coat of yellow ink over the purple base. It will also provide a nice contrast shadow to the bright yellow robe. Continue to work this shadow color in all the folds and creases all the way around the miniature, even on the dark side of Hastur. Don't worry right now about the green tint on the raised areas on the dark side of Hastur. We will come back and address those later in the process. Now we have to get to work base coating all of those tentacles and Venus flytrap models on the base of Hastur in Necromancer Cloak by the Army Painter. This will be a much easier process for you if you skip the airbrush and apply the yellow paint to Hastur's robe using a brush. The yellow overspray from the airbrush must be covered thoroughly. However, if you do not have this overspray, you can just do a heavy dry brush, allowing some of the initial purple base coat to show through in the recesses. After covering all of the yellow overspray, I'm still making sure to allow some of the purple base coat to show through on the underside of the tentacles and in some of the deeper recesses. We will continue adding details to the tentacles by dry brushing up some uniform gray, followed by some ash gray by Army Painter. Take care not to hit Hastur's yellow robe while doing this. The uniform gray will be applied with a heavy dry brush technique, whereas the ash gray will use a more traditional dry brush technique, meaning the ash gray will deposit less paint than the uniform gray. Following the basic dry brush, we will switch to a smaller brush to continue the dry brushing process in some of the harder to reach areas, as well as apply some detail highlights on some of the more raised surfaces. We will then dip back into our purple glaze, which is a mix of muted violet and acrylic medium, and brush that over the area that we just dry brushed with the grays. This will smooth out the transition between the darker purple areas and the light gray dry brushed highlights. We are going to apply this purple glaze quite liberally because we know we're going to go back over this once again with some gray dry brushing. So now we return to the uniform gray and a dry brush and start applying some more conservative dry brushing to the tentacles and base of the model. And just like last time, once we're done doing the general dry brush with a large dry brush, we will once again pick up a smaller brush to dry brush those harder to reach areas, as well as place some very specific highlights in some of the raised areas that we want to appear brighter. And finally, we will repeat the process one more time using ash gray by the Army Painter. First, with a large brush, hitting larger areas of the model, but still depositing a very small amount of paint with each stroke of the brush. Then, once we've gone over the entire model with the large brush, we will switch to a smaller brush and once again, dry brush in those harder to reach places, and finally, apply details to the edges of the tentacles. We will move on to painting Hastur's chest and hands with elven flesh by the Army Painter. We will start with a thin coat, gradually building up layers of this single color until we end up with a nice highlight just dotted in place on some of the details. Then we apply a red wash by Vallejo before going back and reapplying just some highlights to the raised areas with elven flesh. The smooth fleshy tentacles emanating from Hastur's robe will also get a coat of flesh-colored paint, this time Dark Flesh by Vallejo. These fleshy bits can be found absolutely everywhere on this model, including some protruding even from the larger tentacles. Take care not to miss any of these little bits. We are applying the dark flesh in a heavy base coat and going for complete coverage of these areas, which we will go back and tint later. I decided to use this color to paint all of the teeth on the little Venus flytrap thingies. Not that this is necessarily the best color for the teeth, but it was available, and I feel like this isn't really a critical part of the model. I also used the dark flesh to base coat those little eye or orb looking thingies situated at the base of Hastur's robe, and that is just because I intend to paint those red later, and I feel like the red will show up better on a fleshy undercoat. And now that the fleshy tentacles have dried, I'm going back and just making sure that all of them have the amount of coverage that I want, just boosting up the flesh color of some of them. Now I'm going to boost the life of some of those tentacles using a thinned down mix of red wash by Vallejo. I'm going to apply that over a good majority of each tentacle, and then I'll move on to the purple glaze that we created earlier and really apply that down into the base of each tentacle where it meets the body. And using the glaze for this is really going to allow it to blend nicely up into the reds that we added earlier, as well as pooling a little bit in the recess where the tentacle meets the body. And this is where things get wonky. I am obviously missing some critical footage of how I shaded and highlighted the right side of Hastur's body, as well as painting the little red orbs at the base of his robe. If you've seen my Hulk video, I accomplished the shading on Hastur in much the same way that I did for the Incredible Hulk. I used Leviathan Blue by Citadel through an airbrush to spray the right side of the model from the bottom at an upward angle to get a dark blue base for the shadow. Whereas I used electric blue to highlight the Hulk, I don't do that here. I simply add titanium white ink to the Leviathan Blue contrast paint and use that as my highlight for the shaded area of the model. I will be sure to provide a link to the Hulk video at the end of this one, as well as put in a little outtake / blooper of what I did wrong and what resulted in the lost footage, just for your amusement, so y'all can laugh at what an idiot I am. Continuing with the tutorial, the red orbs were painted with Dragon Red by Army Painter and highlighted with a little dot of titanium white ink. And then to paint the rim of the base black, I use my favorite hack, which is to use a cheap black craft paint with 1 drop of black ink to boost the opacity. Lastly, we will take some gloss varnish and apply it to the red orbs to give them a wet look, as well as the fleshy tentacles to give them a disgustingly wet look also. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial on painting up Hastur for your Cthulhu Death May Die board game. And while we all revel in the big reveal of Hastur fully painted, as promised, here is the link to the Hulk video where I show you how to shade the right side of Hastur and shortly provide a clip of my royal screw-up. Oh no, what the fuck?